A lot of these Canadian immigrants, they don't all get the Canadian dream. A lot of these people around the world are said, "Oh, Canada, come to Canada. It's free. Canada accepts all religions, all cultures." But really, only a a small portion of the people who come, it's only free for about half of them because the other half of people who come to Canada, the other half of those immigrants, of those people who come to Canada, they might be deemed as worthy test subjects, expendables to be experimented on in top secret Canadian government underground research facilities. Yes, Canada is not the country of freedom, at least not for all. Sure, there's a lot of rich celebrities that have freedom, but really, does Canada have freedom for everybody? And Canada, why does Canada invite all of these people around the world? Says, oh, Canada is a country of freedom, not for all. Canada, oh, accepts all religions. Canada welcomes all people from all faiths, all religions, all countries. But only half of the people that come to Canada are given freedom. The other half of those immigrants that come to Canada, they are given a prison cell in an underground scientific Canadian top secret government research facility where those immigrants are experimented on. Half of the immigrants that come to Canada are given freedom, but the other half, many of the other half who don't have many of the other half of the immigrants who don't have families, who don't have ties to the community. Maybe they're even criminals. The other half of those immigrants that come to Canada for a better life, supposedly, are end up as test subjects to be experimented on in top secret Canadian underground research facilities in the middle of Canadian forests. Not only are they in the middle of Canadian forests, good luck trying to find them, but then they're mostly underground. So even if you do happen to stumble on the location of a top secret Canadian research facility in the middle of a Canadian forest, well, since most of it is underground, good luck trying to uncover that. Maybe if Donald Trump went in with the military, but he's not going to do that. Those top secret underground Canadian government research facilities, they might even have missing Americans. Hey, do you guys ever really know why things like COVID and mad cow disease and E. coli and what's that thing in the other one? Ebola, Ebola, and mad cow disease, COVID. Do you ever wonder why a lot of these things, where they come from? Obviously, people were saying, "Oh, it came from the Wuhan lab, the Wuhan lab in China." A lot of people accused the COVID from starting from the Wuhan lab in China, the Wuhan lab in China. But what people don't know is that Canada and China have always been secret allies, and China might actually work with the Canadians and have their own joint secret labs, secret governmental underground research facilities in Canada. And so everyone who's blaming China for the COVID, everyone who blames COVID on China, the COVID pandemic on China, and the Wuhan lab, well, you're close, but China also has labs and works with the government of Canada, and they have secret underground Canadian, top secret Canadian underground government research facilities where they take people, innocent people, although sometimes they might also include criminals, but most of them probably are innocent in the sense that, and they are immigrants. Many of them are immigrants that are promised a better life. Oh, come to Canada. Canada's free. Canada has freedom, not for everyone. Canada doesn't have freedom for everyone. Canada, oh, Canada, oh, Canada takes everyone, and Canada accepts all people, all religions. Yeah, Canada has no problem experimenting on anyone from any religion, any faith, any country in the world. And so Canada invites all of these immigrants to come to Canada. And sure, half of those immigrants do get a good Canadian life. Half of the immigrants that come to Canada, they do get good Canadian jobs. But the other half of the immigrants who aren't deemed skilled, who aren't deemed good enough to get jobs, who aren't deemed even sane or considered criminals, or who don't have family ties, no one would know if they went missing. The other half of the immigrants that come to Canada, they end up as research subjects, experimental guinea pigs, and top secret underground Canadian government research facilities in the middle of Canadian forests, which are also protected, and staffed by China as well. The government of China. The government of China and Canada have always been allies, secret allies. All of these news articles that say, oh, Canadian submarines getting into a spat with Chinese submarines, it's all fake. It's all fake because China doesn't want you to know that China and Canada have always been very secret, closeted allies, extreme allies. China and Canada have always been allies. And so that's why they always put out these news articles. Oh, Canadian submarine is fighting with a Chinese submarine. No, they're not fighting. They're friends. They work together, actually. They just don't want Americans to know it. Because if America really knew how deep China's connection was to Canada, how strong allies China and was with Canada, United States would probably invade Canada for real if they knew exactly how deep those bonds were. And so all of these people who want to blame COVID, the COVID pandemic, all these people, they want to blame China. They want to say COVID pandemic, it started in the Wuhan lab in China, Wuhan lab in China, Wuhan lab in China. All these people want to blame COVID on the Wuhan lab in China. Well, you're close. You're definitely close because China definitely does have labs in China as well. But with China, what you don't know is China also works with Canada, and China and Canada have joint. They work together. They have top secret Canadian underground research facilities in the middle of forests, which are staffed, funded by not only the government of Canada, but they're also funded by the government of China. China and Canada have always worked together. And those top secret underground Canadian research facilities in Canada in the middle of Canadian forests, not only are they mostly underground, so even if you manage to find them in the middle of a Canadian forest, and you know those Canadian forests are big, those Canadian forests, even if you manage to find the location within a Canadian forest, good luck because most of it's underground. So those people who end up at these facilities, half of them, half of them were immigrants that were promised a better life. Of course, not all immigrants end up as test subjects in these facilities. Half of the immigrants that come to Canada are actually given jobs. Half of the immigrants that come to Canada are given better lives. But the other half of the immigrants that come to Canada, the other half of the immigrants that are deemed not good enough to get a job, that are deemed possibly they have no family ties, so no one would miss them or notice they went missing. Maybe they're criminals. Maybe they're too old to work, or maybe, a lot of the other half of the immigrants that come to Canada that are promised a better life, they're not given freedom. The other half of the immigrants that come to Canada, they are given a cell, a prison cell, in a top secret government underground Canadian research facility in the middle of a Canadian forest, which is funded and staffed and ran and supported by the government of Canada and the government of China. Both China and Canada experiment on innocent people in these top secret underground Canadian research facilities. So all of these people who said, oh, COVID, the COVID pandemic, it came from the Wuhan labs in China. You're close, very close. China did have something to do with it. But it might have also, COVID might have also came from underground top secret science research facilities in Canada, in the middle of Canadian forests, underground, where no one would think to look. And so all of those people who said, when Candace Owens, right, when she first said her conspiracy theory that Bridget Macron's wife, that the French president's wife was a man, what did everyone say? Oh, you're crazy. That's crazy. The French president's wife is a man? No one would believe it. No one could possibly believe that the French president's wife was a man. Everyone initially thought that Candace Owens was crazy. They called it a crazy conspiracy theory. They tried to shut down her channel. They tried to shut down her YouTube channel. But now, look what's happening. That conspiracy theory where Candace Owens said that the French president's wife is a man is now true. And so you're going to see all of these people trying to come in, trying to shut down my stream, which, thank God, Americans want to know the truth about Canada. Thank God that there are many Americans that want to know the truth about Canada. And why would Trump just randomly say that he wants to make Canada the 51st state? Clearly, Trump must know something about Canada that the average person doesn't know about Canada. Because did Donald Trump say that he wanted to make Mexico the 51st state? Did Donald Trump say he wanted to make Australia the 51st state? Did Donald Trump say he wanted to make Germany the 51st state? No. Donald Trump said Canada, that he needs to even considering bringing the military to make Canada the 51st state. Why would Donald Trump, of all the countries in the world, especially Canada, which you think is this nice country, everybody's nice, and there's human rights and freedom. Well, you're not allowed to have a gun. Canada has the most strictest gun control policies in the world. And if Texans try to bring their American guns to Canada, the Canadian police will put those Texans in prison and take away their American guns away. So clearly, Canada is not the free country that you think it is. That the Canadian media, they always go on the news and say, oh, Canada is such a free country and we have human rights. Oh, but you're not allowed to have a gun to defend yourself. Because if the Texans from Texas bring their guns to Canada, the Canadian Border Patrol, which by the way, most of them are Chinese at the Canadian border, the Canadian Border Patrol will pummel those American Texans and take away their American guns. So all of these people, first they said Candace Owens saying the French president's wife was a man. They say, oh, that's crazy. That's a crazy conspiracy theory. No one believed Candace Owens at first. At first, no one believed Candace Owens. They called her crazy. They tried to shut down her YouTube channel, Candace Owens. And now look what happened. It's true. The French president's wife is really a man. He really is a man. But all of these people said, oh, it's a crazy conspiracy theory. Oh, that's crazy. The French president's wife, a man? Really? No. And now you're going to see all these people come into my stream and say, oh, top secret underground Canadian research facilities in the middle of the forest that are run and operated by the government of Canada and the government of China. Oh, that's crazy. Oh, no, no, no. That could never happen. No. Why would the Canadian government find value in researching science drug and researching their pharmaceuticals, their deadly experimental pharmaceuticals on innocent prisoners? Why would the Canadian government and the Chinese government want to experiment with their highly experimental pharmaceutical drugs onto innocent Canadian prisoners? Why? Or and even some American prisoners, Americans that went missing. Why would the government of Canada and why would the government of China think it would be useful to have a top secret underground Canadian science research facility where they take the most experimental drugs, the most experimental therapies, the most experimental potions, the most experimental drugs, and they experiment on innocent people with these highly experimental pharmaceuticals? Why would the government of Canada want to have human test subjects to experiment cloning, to experiment genetically modified foods, and then touch the genetically modified genome to try to modify DNA? Why would Chinese scientists and Canadian scientists think it would be valuable to have an underground top secret research facility in the middle of the Canadian forest where they get to experiment on people, where Canadian scientists and Chinese scientists get to experiment on people with these new experimental pharmaceuticals, with these experimental drugs? Why would the government of Canada and the government of China want to experiment on people with these new experimental drugs, these experimental procedures, experimental drugs, experimental procedures, experimental pills, experimental therapies? Why would the government of Canada and the government of China think it would be useful to have an underground top secret research facility, which of course is not legal, in the middle of a Canadian forest where Canadian scientists and Chinese scientists can experiment on innocent people? Why would they find that to be useful? I don't know. Why is the French president's wife a man? Why is the French president's wife a man? Answer that question. I don't know. It just is, okay? The government of Canada and the government of China, they want to test all of their experimental pharmaceuticals, experimental procedures, experimental this, experimental that, everything that a scientist could dream of experimenting on humans. Cloning genetically modified foods, mind control, genetically modified foods, everything that a scientist, a mad scientist, a crazy scientist, everything that a mad scientist could ever dream of experimenting on a human, they do it in top secret underground research facilities in the middle of Canada, which may also have many missing Americans as well. Those Americans that just vanished, those missing Americans that just vanished and no one knows what happened to them, they might be prisoners in top secret underground Canadian research facilities in the middle of a Canadian forest. But of course, unless Trump actually has the balls to send the American military to make Canada the 51st state, you'll never know. You'll never know if those underground top secret Canadian research facilities in the middle of a Canadian forest really have those missing Americans. You'll never know because Trump doesn't have the balls to get the American military to invade Canada and make Canada the 51st state. So you'll probably never find those missing Americans or those missing immigrants from all around the world, missing Venezuelans, missing Germans, missing Australians, missing Japanese. I don't, maybe even missing Chinese. I don't know if the Chinese government would experiment on their own people. I don't know if the Chinese government, if the government of Canada, the government of China. Well, I know the government of Canada will experiment on Canadians, but I don't know if the government of China would experiment on Chinese prisoners Because, of course, Chinese people have special rights. Chinese people have the right not to be stolen from. Chinese people have the right not to be ridiculed. Chinese people have the right not to have a job. And Chinese people, Chinese people have more rights than we do, right? So I don't know if the government of China would experiment on their own people, but I do know that Canada experiments on people all from all around the world. It's true. Canada will accept experimental test subjects from every country, every religion, every faith. Canada welcomes everyone. Canada wants to test their new experimental procedures on Iranians, on Middle Eastern people, on Asians, on Australians, on Africans. Canada wants to test these new experimental pharmaceuticals on Africans, on Asians, on everyone, on Australians, on Germans, on Europeans. Canada would love to test their new procedures, experimental operation procedures, on everyone from all around the world. And then all these people come in and say, oh, well, we were so stupid that we didn't know that the French president's wife was a man. And then when Candace Owens told us she was a man, we still called her crazy and called her a liar. Now we all know that the French president's wife's a man. The same people who are going to call me crazy and try to shut down my YouTube live stream are the same people that called Candace Owens crazy when she said that the French president's wife was really a man. You said Candace Owens was crazy too. You said Candace Owens was a crazy conspiracy theorist when she said that the French president's wife was really a man. No one believed her. No one believed Candace Owens. Now the truth has come out that the French president's wife is really a man. And are you apologizing to Candace Owens for calling her crazy when she was right all along? And those same people that called Candace Owens crazy when Candace Owens said that the French president's wife was a man, those same people are probably coming now into my live stream calling me crazy, saying, oh, this is a crazy conspiracy theory. Just like when Candace Owens said that the French president's wife was really a man. Crazy conspiracy theory. It's actually more plausible and makes more sense that the government of Canada, which, by the way, as you know, doesn't even allow Americans to have guns to defend them, doesn't allow Canadians to have guns to defend themselves. But let me tell you, if it were up to the government of Canada, if it were up to the government of Canada and they could take away your American guns, they would. If it were up to the government of China and they could take away your American guns, they would, because that's how they operate Canada and China. In Canada, they do not allow people to have guns. They don't, to defend themselves. In fact, if American Texans, if you could just call the Canadian police and ask them, if you ask the Canadian police, what would happen if a bunch of Texans from Texas, gun-owning, proud American Texans from Texans with guns, what would happen if they went to Canada? You know what the Canadian police would say? The Canadian police would send 100 police cars to confiscate the American guns. They'd put the Texans in prison, in Canadian prison. They would take the Texans with guns and put them in Canadian prison because the government of Canada does not allow people to have guns. So that same government of Canada, which doesn't allow humans to have guns to defend themselves, is the same government of Canada and the government of China. They work together and they experiment on innocent prisoners. They experiment new experimental procedures. They experiment cloning. They experiment genetically modified food. They experiment with the human genome. They play around with people's DNA. They play around with they purposely try to cause mutations. They purposely try to cause experimental mutations in people. And then you wonder why you see all these people. Sometimes you see people walking around with two heads. Sometimes you see people walking around with a third leg. Sometimes you see people walking around with so much hair, they look like Sasquatch with hair all over their body. Why are there all of these mutations suddenly happening? Why are people suddenly becoming mutated? Why? Because the government of Canada and the government of China, they like to experiment with mutations on innocent prisoners. And they like to experiment pharmaceutical drugs. Hey, this whole Ozempic, Ozempic was deemed safe enough. Ozempic was deemed safe enough for the masses. But there's actually even worse drugs that they've experimented on humans, much worse than Ozempic. So Ozempic was deemed safe enough for the masses, but there's actually much worse experimental drugs that they experimented on humans in those top secret underground Canadian research facilities in the middle of Canadian forests. If you are drugged and fall down in a forest, does it make a sound? If you are kidnapped in the middle of a Canadian forest and brought to a top secret underground Canadian research facility, does it make a sound? From every country in the world, why would Donald Trump say that he wanted to make Canada the 51st state? And isn't that especially odd? Since all of these years on the Canadian news, you heard Canada's such a great country. Canada is so nice. Canada has freedom, not for everyone. Canada has human rights. Well, they don't allow Canadians to have guns. You don't have the right to have a gun in Canada to defend yourself. And not everyone in Canada has human rights. Of course, the rich politicians, the rich French Canadian politicians who speak French and live in $1 million homes and they go on trips to Hawaii and then they laugh at poor Americans that live in trailer parks. Of course, the rich French Canadian rich elites, they have human rights, they have freedom of speech. Of course, the rich French Canadian rich elites, they have human rights, they have freedom of speech. Of course, these big celebrities like Taylor Swift. Oh, God forbid someone copies one of Taylor Swift's songs. Which is garbage to begin with. Imagine someone copying garbage. Imagine if someone copied one of Taylor Swift's songs. Taylor Swift would sue. Taylor Swift would do more than just shake it off. If somebody copied one of Taylor Swift's songs, if a potential uprising artist, if a new artist, a new singer, copied one of Taylor Swift's songs, she would sue them in court. Meanwhile, there's all of these innocent prisoners being experimented on, and they're using top secret government underground science research facilities in the middle of Canadian forests to experiment on innocent people. They experiment new experimental pharmaceutical drugs like Ozempic, for example. Ozempic, Ozempic, which was deemed safe enough. Ozempic, which was deemed safe enough for consumer use. But trust me, there's a lot more worse drugs than Ozempic that are definitely not safe, not enough, not at all for the consumers. And those drugs, those experimental drugs, were used to experiment on innocent prisoners in top secret underground Canadian research facilities in the middle of Canadian forests where no one can hear you scream. And so all of these people who said, "Oh, they're going to blame China for COVID, the COVID pandemic, they're going to blame China and the Wuhan labs, Wuhan labs in China. Oh, they're going to blame the Wuhan labs in China." You're close. You're very close. You're extremely close to Canada, actually. You're very close. China did have something to do with it, for sure. I wouldn't know for sure if I could pinpoint exactly whether it was the Wuhan labs or whether it was the top secret underground Canadian research facilities in the middle of Canadian forest, it definitely did come from one of those labs. The COVID pandemic definitely did come from one of those labs. But it might not just have only been the Wuhan lab in China that it came from. It might have also been the top secret underground Canadian research facility in the middle of Canadian forests, which, by the way, are funded by the government of China and are funded by the government of Canada. Because Canada and China have always been allies, secret allies. Of course, China wants to trick Americans, right? And so China, if China's going to use spies, okay, think about this logically for a sec. If China is going to use a spy as person who to spy on Americans, if China is going to take someone to spy on Americans, you think Chinese people are going to use themselves? Well, sometimes they do. But wouldn't it be smarter to use a Canadian? Wouldn't it, if the government of China wanted to hire spies to spy on Americans, wouldn't it make more sense to hire a Canadian who can walk like an American, talk like an American, look like an American? If the government of China is going to hire spies to spy on Americans, well, if they use Chinese spies, it's really hard for Chinese spies to get around in America because all of these Americans be like, this Chinese, Chinese. But the government of China loves to use Canadians to spy on Americans because Canadians, we look, we walk, we talk like Americans, we can do American accents. There are currently Canadian operatives that work for the government of China. And these Canadian operatives are all across the United States. They walk American, they look American, they talk American, they speak with perfect American accents. And secretly, these people work for the government of China. It makes sense because why would the government of China want to only use, of course, they also use Chinese spies. It's not that they don't use Chinese spies at all, but Chinese spies, it's hard for Chinese spies to get around in America when they look Chinese and they are Chinese because the Americans just be like Chinese. But Canadians, Canadians, we look like Americans, we can walk like Americans, we can talk like Americans. There are currently Canadian operatives situated all across the United States. These people, you don't know they're Canadian, but they look American, they talk American, they walk American, they speak with perfect American accents, and you would have no clue that they're really Canadian and they work for the government of China. You have no clue. These people look like everyday Americans. They talk like Americans, they walk like Americans, they speak with perfect American accents, but really they're Canadians. And they're Canadians who work for the government of China. Hey, didn't you recently, just 2 months ago, remember you caught those two Chinese nationals? It was all over the American news. If you just search the American news, two Chinese nationals were caught in the United States allegedly trying to smuggle in dangerous pathogens. Two Chinese university research students, whatever, they were either from a university, whatever, two Chinese nationals were caught in the United States trying to smuggle in dangerous pathogens into the United States. And you're trying to tell me that we're not in the middle of a biological war with China? People are trying to tell me that we're not in the middle of a biological war with China. You just caught two of them 2 months ago. Yeah, it was all over the American news. Two Chinese nationals were caught in the United States trying to smuggle in dangerous pathogens into the United States. And you're trying to tell me, oh, that America is not in a biological war with China? And that China doesn't have, with Canada, secret underground research facilities where they experiment with this biological warfare on innocent people in the middle of Canadian forests? Where do you think that China experiments with these biological warfare? Where do you think China experiments these with these dangerous pathogens and biological agents. Where do you think China experiments with this? You think China just experiments on crash test dummies? You think those crash test dummies in the cars, those dummies, you think those crash test dummies in the cars, remember those car commercials, those crash test car commercials with the crash test dummies? You think they use mannequins? You think that the Chinese government, the government of China, experiments top secret biological warfare on mannequins? No. They experiment on innocent prisoners in underground, top secret Canadian and Chinese government research facilities in the middle of Canadian forests. This is not a looped video. Who came in and said this was a looped video? This is not a looped video. Okay? This is real. This is a real live stream. This person came in and it's let me see who it was. JBIV Jibiv, whatever. He said, "Oh, this is just a loop video, lol." No, it's not. It's not a loop video. And me saying it's not a loop video proves it's not a loop video. And then Jerry also said he had to record. No, this is a live stream. You think someone came in and said, "Oh, report this to the CIA." Isn't this, you mean the same CIA which Candace Owens is blabbing about with this top secret MK Ultra stuff? You want to report this to the CIA? The same who do you think's been Are you crazy? The CIA, the American CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, does not have the interests of the American people. And Candace Owens has made this very clear. Report this to the CIA. That's the funniest thing I've ever heard. If you are in one of those top secret underground Canadian research facilities in the middle of the forest, and for some miracle by God, you manage to get a phone in those top secret security research facilities, and you manage to get reception, and you get to make one phone call, and the one call you make is to the CIA, oh my God. You'd have more luck calling the Quickie Mart. You'd have more luck calling the Quickie Mart. What? Top secret government research facility in the middle of Canada? What? What are you talking? You'd have more luck calling the Quickie Mart than the CIA. You're in the middle of nowhere in an underground top secret government science research facility underground in Canada, run by China, operated by government of China, operated by the government of China and Canada, and you finally get access to a phone by miracle, by miracle of God. You actually get access to a telephone and you get reception and you get to make one call and you waste the call on calling the CIA. Candace Owens has made it very clear that the CIA does not have the interest of the American people. Candace Owens has made this very clear. The French president's wife is a man. What more proof do you need? The French president's wife is a man, and the CIA knew about it all of these years because the CIA used it to control France. The CIA uses these puppets. The CIA has installed these puppets into all these other countries, and then that's how the CIA, the American CIA, controls these countries like France by controlling the presidents, the weirdo presidents, who all they want to do is do weirdo stuff, but then they have to, as long as they do whatever the United States wants them to do, as long as French President Emmanuel Macron does whatever the CIA wants, then he can be a weirdo and do whatever he wants to, this weirdo stuff. This person, wealthy, something skeleton, came in and said something about taking my freedom of speech away. I'm afraid it's too late. It's gone way beyond that because, unfortunately for you, Mr. wants to take our free speech away. Um, the evidence which you're asking for, you're demanding for on a live stream, you're demanding for my original copies of the evidence, which who knows what you would do with it. Uh, you want this evidence. Well, guess what? The evidence was already given to Mr. Donald Trump and the White House. And not just the White House, but to other countries around the world, which will be nameless, which we will not mention for the countries for the country's well-being. But there are other countries around the world that do have the evidence. The evidence was given to them. Copies of the evidence. So again, let's go back to my original point. Why would Donald Trump suddenly say randomly out of the blue that he wants to make Canada the 51st state? Isn't that odd? Especially from all the countries around the world, which Trump could say he wants to take over. Why would he say Canada? He could have said he wants to make Mexico the 51st state, Germany the 51st state, Australia the 51st state. But no, Donald Trump said Canada. Why? Because Donald Trump and the White House, they have been given evidence for years now. Canadian whistleblowers and other whistleblowers around the world have given the evidence, have sent the videos, have sent all of the articles, the evidence, the even pictures to the White House. And that is why Donald Trump suddenly, he didn't just say it randomly out of the blue that wants to make Canada the 51st state. The White House has a lot of evidence and dirt on Canada. But see, when Donald Trump said he wanted to make Canada the 51st state, the average person, the average people, the masses didn't believe him, didn't like him, didn't want him to take over Canada. Because the average person doesn't know the truth about Canada and how corrupt Canada really is. And that's why when Donald Trump came out and said, oh, he wants to make Canada the 51st state and take over Canada, everyone was like, oh, those nice Canadians? Really? Those nice Canadians could never do anything bad, like have top secret underground research facilities in the middle of a Canadian forest, secretly run by the government of Canada and the government of China, where they experiment on innocent people with where they experiment on innocent people with drugs, with pharmaceutical drugs, and experimental operational procedures, and other experimental stuff like cloning. No, the government of Canada. So when Donald Trump said that, oh, maybe we should take over Canada and make Canada the 51st state, since they have all this evidence against Canada. But instead of Trump actually saying, oh, declaring war, because if Donald Trump declares war on Canada, that's another bad strategic move. Because Donald Trump plays to win, and he's strategic. And if he declares war on Canada, Canada will bring China and Russia and other countries that the United States doesn't want to fight. So it's not as simple as Donald Trump just declaring war on Canada and taking Canada over. But Donald Trump and the White House, they didn't just randomly say about making Canada the 51st state for no reason. They know. They know the truth.